Why am I a journalist? I am a journalist because I have a great love for writing, and from that love for writing, I became a journalist. And then I discovered that being a journalist was a real privilege because it helped me to become a very active citizen in my own country, because it allowed me to hold accountable the people in power. It allowed me to highlight wrongs that were happening in society, and it helped me to make a difference in my country. The challenges I faced when I was in the traditional print media was government control through legislation. So there were many times when certain topics could not be reported on. For example, when I was a young journalist, I covered the environment, and I used to cover the annual haze incident. And I was told several times in those years that I couldn't report on, for example, the air pollutant index, because the API was made an official secret at some point in our history. I couldn't cover critical voices about the Bakun Dam project, for example. So clearly there were these controls in the newsroom, and because the paper could lose its license, then it became a really real restriction that editors had to grapple with on a daily basis. Of course, there was also the ownership issue, where the paper I was working for was owned by a political party in the Barisan Nasional. And so we were often nudged or told or compelled to cover events by the leaders of this particular party. And as a result, less resources could be devoted to other public interest issues. And this became even more problematic during the election period, when we were forced to cover news by the Barisan Nasional, and on many occasions blocked out news by the opposition at that point in time. As an online journalist now, since starting the Nutgraph, I think the greatest challenge is trying to make the business a viable business. As many people know, the Nutgraph had to shut its office, and we retrenched everybody in September of 2010. We continue to maintain the website from home, and the reality is that I don't know how to make it a financially viable business, and I don't know how much longer we can keep the Nutgraph going in a way that pays the writers and editors a fair sum for the work that they do. Why am I still a journalist? I am still a journalist because I guess my passion for writing is an enduring one, and also because I think that it keeps me really engaged in this country's history and its current developments. It really helps me to be aware about what's going on in my country and what are the things that citizens can and should be doing to make Malaysia a better place. And I think being a journalist is a privilege and a luxury, and it really is like Spider-Man says, with great power comes great responsibility. So I feel like being a journalist gives me this great responsibility and this great power to make a difference in Malaysia. And for that reason, I remain a journalist today despite all the challenges. What are my expectations for my career? Truth be told, after doing this for nearly 20 years, I think the prospects for any kind of career development for me are pretty slim in Malaysia, just because the media, whether it's the traditional or the new media, haven't grown in a particular way just because of the environment that we exist in. I think that many of the opportunities for seasoned journalists to grow are overseas, in countries like Australia or the US or the UK, where journalism is far more well developed. And I think my expectations are for me to be able to access those opportunities, and then to come back with new skills, new insights, and to help develop the Malaysian industry. The question is, of course, whether or not the environment is going to be conducive for that kind of development to happen. I think for so long as we have media laws, prohibitive media laws in place, and for so long as we have the current ownership structures in place, then it will be a challenge to try and implement those kinds of ideals, high ethical standards, even the kind of intelligence that we see in some of the better developed media overseas, I think it'll be difficult to implement those here. I think it's possible to do it in small ways and to see whether it can snowball. And I think that my expectations for my own career is increasingly moving towards training and mentoring younger journalists, because I think that unless we train and mentor young journalists who will eventually take over the industry, we're not going to get a media that's increasingly more intelligent, more ethical, more independent, more courageous. So I think the expectation for my career is kind of tied into my expectations for better journalism in Malaysia. Media freedom for me means working in an environment where I am completely independent of political interference, as well as financial or commercial interests. So it means being able to report independently and without fear or favor, because I'm free from these kinds of influences, I'm free from these kinds of interferences in the newsroom. And media freedom for me also means working in an environment where the media can have access to government data. So really, media freedom for me is very, very closely linked to having freedom of information in this country. And for so long as we do not have legislation that makes it mandatory for government agencies to release data, then talking about media freedom is like talking about a vacuum, like existing in a vacuum. So very, very critically for me, media freedom means being able to do my job as the fourth estate, as the agency that holds accountable power, as independently and as fearlessly as I can, so that I can uphold the basic purpose of journalism, which is to uphold public interest. So that's what media freedom means to me. I don't think I've ever experienced a time in my life where I had complete media freedom. Definitely not when I was in the traditional print media. And as an online journalist, we did have a lot of independence, because we were not controlled by the state, nor were we controlled by any politician. And the truth is that we had to grapple with the financial difficulties of sustaining a business. So for now, I think being in the online media is the place where a journalist can potentially experience more media freedom than when one is in the traditional media.